As we enter into the final month before the 2024 election, the presidential race remains a virtual toss-up with Harris and Trump neck by neck in the polls. In this video, we will be taking a look at the 2024 election map based on the latest polls in all 50 states. Before we get started, please subscribe to my channel for more election content and more election predictions, as well as real-time updates on major events leading up to the 2024 election. In order for a candidate to win the election, he or she must secure at least 270 electoral votes. But before we take a look into the states, let's take a look at who leads in the national polls. According to the 538 presidential election national polling averages, we see that Kamala Harris leads by 2.6%. From this, we can see that Kamala Harris holds a slight lead on Trump nationally, but the question is, will this slight lead hold up in the key battleground states that will ultimately decide this election? Join us as we take a look at how each state is expected to vote based on the newest polls conducted in the state. We will start by filling out the solid states for each candidate. These are states that candidates are expected to win by over 15% in margin on election day. For Kamala Harris, those solid states would include Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Illinois, Vermont, Maine's 1st District, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, Delaware, and the District of Columbia. For Donald Trump, his solid states would include Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, and West Virginia. With the solid states filled out, Kamala Harris stands at 139 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 108 electoral votes. We will now be moving on to the likely states for each candidate. These are states that candidates are expected to win by 7 to 12% in margin on election day. For Kamala Harris, those likely states would include Colorado, New Mexico, Virginia, New Jersey, New York, New Hampshire, Allstate, Maine, and the state of Minnesota. For Donald Trump, he will likely win the states of Alaska, Nebraska's district, Allstate, Nebraska, and the state of Indiana. With the likely states filled out, Kamala Harris stands at 225 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 125 electoral votes. We will now be moving on to the lean states for each candidate. These are states that candidates are expected to win by 2 to 7% in margin according to the polls. For Kamala Harris, the 2nd Congressional District of Nebraska will go to her by a lean margin, bringing her total up to 226 electoral votes. For Donald Trump, his lean states would include Iowa, Ohio, Texas, and Florida. Trump won all of these states in both 2016 and in 2020, and even when they were projected to be toss-up states in 2020, Trump still won them by a comfortable margin. In 2020, Florida was projected to go to Biden by 3%, but Trump ended up winning it by 3%, even expanding on his lead in 2016. For Texas, Trump was supposed to narrowly win the state by less than 1%, but Trump ended up carrying it by a comfortable margin of 5.6%. With the lean states, Kamala Harris stands at 226 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 218 electoral votes. We will now be moving on to the final toss-up states where the candidates are deadlocked in a margin less than 2%. These key battleground states will ultimately decide the 2024 election and the next president of the United States of America. We will start with the state of Nevada and its 6 electoral votes. Taking a look at the latest polling averages in Nevada, we see that Kamala Harris leads by 1.0%. This is a state that Democrats won by 2.4% in both 2016 and in 2020, and even though the Republican Party has made decent gains in Nevada in the last 4 years, Kamala Harris is still on track to win it by a very slight margin. This brings her total up to 232 electoral votes as we move on to the state of Arizona. In 2020, Biden made a historic flip in the state of Arizona, winning it by 0.3%. However, 4 years later, Harris is not at the point at which Biden was at 4 years ago. We can see this reflected in the latest polling averages in Arizona as Donald Trump leads by 1.5%. Arizona has shifted to the right since 2020 because Kamala Harris is losing support amongst Hispanic and black voters, which primarily make up the Sun Belt, but she is gaining support amongst white voters, which primarily make up the Rust Belt. This is a common trend you'll see amongst the Sun Belt states where Donald Trump has improved since 4 years ago, but from the Rust Belt, it's a different story. However, as of now, Donald Trump is on track to win Arizona and its 11 electoral votes. We will now be moving on to the state of Georgia, which once again was a state that Biden narrowly carried in the 2020 election. Taking a look at the polling averages in Georgia, we see that Donald Trump leads by 1.0%. Georgia is a very similar state to Arizona when it comes to elections. And just like Arizona, Georgia is a state where black and Hispanic voters make up a good chunk of their population, and Harris is not performing as well as Biden was 4 years ago amongst these Hispanic and black voters, which will give Donald Trump a slight boost in this state. We can see this reflected in the Georgia polling averages where Donald Trump does hold a slight lead over Harris. This last month before the election is crucial, and Georgia could really go to either candidate. However, as of now, Donald Trump is slightly favored to win the state of Georgia and its 16 electoral votes. With Georgia filled out, Donald Trump stands at 245 electoral votes to Kamala Harris's 232 electoral votes as we move on to the final states that will ultimately decide this election. Let's take a look at the state of North Carolina. Taking a look at the polling averages in North Carolina, we see that Donald Trump leads by 0.8%. North Carolina is one of the states that's always tended to vote Republican, besides for Obama in 2008. However, North Carolina has always been a battleground state that comes down to the wire between the two candidates. And as of now, Donald Trump does hold a slight lead, but Kamala Harris could very much so win North Carolina, as Hurricane Helene has devastated western North Carolina, where voters tend to favor Trump over Harris. The White House, as well as state governments, have really put forth a good effort into recovering from Hurricane Helene. However, it is an unfortunate reality that voter turnout will be damaged in western North Carolina because of the devastation caused by the hurricane. Keeping that in mind, Donald Trump still does hold a slight lead on Harris in North Carolina, so I will be giving North Carolina to Donald Trump by a very slight margin. And now we are down to our final states, the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. In 2020, Biden was able to win all three of these states, but let's take a look at where Harris and Trump stand as of today. We will start with the state of Wisconsin. Taking a look at the polling averages in Wisconsin, we see that Kamala Harris leads by 1.6%. As we were talking about earlier, Harris is underperforming amongst Hispanic and black voters, but she is actually performing better amongst white voters than Biden was 4 years ago. And unlike the Sun Belt, the Rust Belt is primarily made up of white voters, which will give Kamala Harris an advantage. And not only that, but this election is expected to have the highest turnout in history, which does tend to favor the Democrats. With many factors including Harris leading in the polls, demographic favoritism in the Rust Belt towards Harris, and an expected high turnout in this election, I will be giving Wisconsin to Kamala Harris by a very slight margin. Moving on to the state of Michigan. Taking a look at the polling averages in Michigan, we see that Kamala Harris leads by 1.6%. In 2020, Biden carried Michigan by 2.8%, which is a bigger margin than he carried any other swing state, even Nevada. The same demographic factors in Wisconsin can also be applied to Michigan, as Michigan is one of the most white states in the US. Ever since 2020, Michigan has very slightly shifted to the right, and Kamala Harris still stands in a very good position to carry Michigan. The newest poll in Michigan even shows Kamala Harris up by 6, which is a huge lead in a swing state like Michigan. Keeping all of this in mind, I will be giving Michigan to Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. With Michigan, Kamala Harris stands at 257 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 261 electoral votes, which means the state of Pennsylvania will be the deciding state in the 2024 election. Whoever wins Pennsylvania will cross the 270 electoral count threshold required to become the next president of the United States of America. Let's take a look at the polls in Pennsylvania. Taking a look at the polling averages in Pennsylvania, we see that Kamala Harris leads by 0.7%. Both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have spent the majority of their resources and time in Pennsylvania because of its 19 electoral vote count and how it will be the tipping point state in the 2024 election. In 2020, Biden carried Pennsylvania by 1.2%, and even though Pennsylvania has shifted to the right by a very slight margin, Kamala Harris is still on track to win. The latest Fox News poll, which is a right-leaning organization, has Harris up by 2, which is a decent margin in Pennsylvania. Not only is it good just on its own, but coming from a conservative news organization, it shows how Harris is performing well in Pennsylvania. Demographically, Pennsylvania is similar to Wisconsin and Michigan in that it is a Rust Belt state where white voters primarily make up the state. With the demographic advantages as well as many other factors, I will be giving Pennsylvania to Kamala Harris by a very slight margin, which means that Kamala Harris has passed the 270 electoral count threshold to become the next president of the United States of America. Harris stands at 276 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 261 electoral votes, making this the second closest election in American history. And finally, the state of Maine will go to Donald Trump by a very slight margin, making the final electoral count 276 for Kamala Harris to 262 for Donald Trump. If you made it here, please subscribe to my channel for more election content and more election predictions leading up to the 2024 election, and follow me on Twitter linked in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.